QPL's annual It's Time for Kind initiative is a seasonal celebration of the big and small acts of generosity that can turn a whole day around. Attend programs for all ages that promote kindness, contribute to our annual canned food drive, share your kindness story on our kindness walls, and more. Visit queenslib.org/It's Time for Kind to learn more. Queens Public Library wishes you and your loved ones a very happy holiday. Throughout the season, we'll be offering a joyful and vibrant selection of all ages books, movies, music, crafts, programs, and more. Join us in the festivities, and thank you for being part of our community. For more information, visit queenslib.org/holidays 2022. Help us connect Queens residents to life-changing programs and services like this one. Now through December 31st, the impact of all gifts to the Queens Public Library Foundation will double through our matching gift challenge. To contribute, visit qplf.org/match 2022.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wellness Wednesdays. I'm Franny Kent, the Director of Programming at the Queens Public Library. Today, we welcome back Cherise Francis for our monthly workshop series, where we will read and discuss excerpts from essays and generate written work based on prompts inspired by the memoir anthology, You Are Your Best Thing, Vulnerability, Shame, Resilience, and the Black Experience, edited by Tarana Burke and Brene Brown. Based on the quotation from Toni Morrison's Beloved, how can we see ourselves as our own best thing? How does living in our truth give us the breathing room to be our full selves? We will be doing a deep dive into various themes like vulnerability, family, healing, spirituality, social and institutional oppressions, art, and memory. Cherise, we're so happy to have you. Please take it away.
Thank you, Franny. So today we're talking about education and healing. So first, I want to start with this picture. So this is from a news report about the Brown versus Board of Education ruling in 1954 that allowed for schools to be integrated. But in thinking about Brown versus Board of Education, I want us to think about the differences between the legal system and legal rulings that allow for allowed for integration, but that uh, there wasn't thought processes into how we can reshape the larger cultural systems that we have that can help facilitate integration. And so I'll be speaking a little bit about the failures of integration. Not that integration in theory isn't a good idea, but the need for cultivating a space that allows for marginalized groups to be able to thrive in that space. And when institutions like educational systems don't cultivate a space for marginalized people to thrive in a space, it actually can cause more harm than good. And this picture is a picture of Elizabeth Eckford, who was one of the Little Rock Nine, who is one of the students to start the integration of various schools. So events like Little Rock Nine, we tend to think of them in a kind of vacuum, where it's this event where these Black students were invited to be the first to integrate into majority white schools. And we tend to think of it as a single moment in history. And this is also a failure in how these cultural events are taught as well, that we talk about them as one large event and we don't think about the day-to-day life of the people who actually have to integrate into these schools. So in researching about Little Rock Nine, I found out how the lifelong trauma of these students who tried to integrate into these schools. So, for example, Minnie Jean Brown, her story from the Smithsonian, she talked about how on a day-to-day basis at school, she was subjected to verbal and physical assaults from the students around her. The Little Rock Nine, they were all isolated from each other and they were never placed in classes with each other. And that also is harmful because they didn't have a support system with each other to be able to endure this new environment. Um, and Minnie Jean had to experience various assaults, like having food spilled on her, having, people knock into her and taunt her, and they would never receive any, punishments for that. But when she tried to fight back and defend herself, she ended up being, expelled from school. So, also talking about the double treatment of, different students in a school plays into this discussion as well. So I mentioned Elizabeth Eckford, and she talks about why there are certain details left out of the narrative of the Little Rock Nine. And she said, for many people, the worst we endured was what we endured on our first attempt to go to school. She adds that part of the misconception was their fault, not sharing the full extent of what they had experienced. The superintendent urged the students not to talk to the press, and it was decided that nothing about what went on inside the schools were published. The NAACP encouraged the Nine to make it look like desegregation was working. So we contributed to that. Among the nine of us, none of us talked about what was going on inside the schools for 30 years. Sorry. Even at home, she didn't discuss the verbal and physical harassment she and the other 8 students face because she knew her mother would take her out of Central, Eckford adds. And more on the history can be found on thehistory.com, the story behind the famous Little Rock Nine scream image. But in essence, from Eckford's story, we see how in trying to force integration and not talk about the larger cultural processes of integration, it actually caused, the students more harm than good because it's not simply just creating a law and saying, "Here it is." It's a process of cultivating a space for the people entering a space. And Terrence Roberts, another member of Little Rock Nine, who's now a psychologist, said, Brown versus Board of Education was a very important decision because it changed the legal framework in this country. Prior to 1954 decision, it was deemed constitutional to discriminate. In 1954, the legal framework was changed, but nothing was done about the social, socio-economic, philosophical, and habitual patterns that have been developed that sustain segregation. None of that has been addressed, and that is what gives rise to our current state of troubles. And when Terrence mentions our current state of troubles, I want to relate that to the current controversy over critical race theory. And a lot of people don't understand what critical race theory is, but it's basically a way of understanding how American racism has shaped public policy, especially in educational systems and schools, and of course, other institutions as well. And from Education's Week, What is Critical Race Theory and Why is it Under Attack? Scholars who study critical race theory in education look at how policies and practices in K through 12 education contribute to the persistent racial inequalities in education and advocate for ways to change them. Among the topics they've studied, racially segregated schools, the underfunding of majority Black and Latino school districts, disproportionate disciplining of Black students, barriers to gifted programs, and selective admission high schools and curricula that reinforce racist ideas. Critical race theory is not a synonym for culturally relevant teaching, which emerged in the 1990s. This teaching approach seeks to affirm students' ethnic and racial backgrounds and is intellectually rigorous, but it is related in that one of its aims is to help students identify and critique the causes of social inequality in their own lives. So, as you can see, that critical race theory actually dives deeper into the conditions and processes that cause that gives shape to a lot of the trauma and oppressions that marginalized groups have to endure and grow through. It's not as simple as creating a law. Um, there's much more that has to go into it. And as Elizabeth Eckford and Terrence mentioned in their own telling of their stories, a lot of this could have been addressed sooner if they were able to talk about their personal experiences at Little Rock Nine, as Little Rock Nine, because a lot of what they endured is still something that is happening today. So, in thinking about all that, I want to read from Jessica J. Williams' essay, Black Surrender Within the Ivory Tower. Writing is the place where I have allowed myself to become most vulnerable. From a computer, I type with my eyes closed and almost in a trance. I allow my words to come, sometimes despite my outlines, planning, and internal editing. I don't know what I feel until I read what I have written. The words that arrive are the ones that simply have to be heard. I surrender to them. Surrendering has become one of my favorite practices. In considering how to begin to tell a bit of my story, I had to return to the familiarity of my ritual to remember to trust my own process. Several now deleted drafts prior, I was too distracted by performing, allowing my mask to speak for me instead of trusting my own voice to narrate. After each draft, I convinced myself that the editors would read it and determine it was a mistake to have invited me to contribute. I feared not being good enough or being found out somehow as if I had not earned the right to speak, or if I am being truly honest, had not earned the right to be heard. Imposter syndrome grew into self doubt, and my thoughts snowballed from you aren't good enough to write this essay to you aren't good enough to write any essay. I was shame spiraling, people pleasing, and most worrisome when I wrote I was performing for the white gaze and consumerism. Thinking of all the ways I would or could be applauded and praised for the work I had yet to even complete. True to exactly what I researched, fear, doubt, and cynicism were hindering my ability to be present. I had to tune out everything and every voice around me and remind myself that this work, like all my work, was a try. It was, and I am allowed to be and become without expectation. My practice of surrendering is one I began to actively work on after I was sexually assaulted during graduate school in 2015. Having been trained as a therapist and 4 years into my leadership doctoral program, I knew I needed to ask for help immediately, but truly lacked the capacity to understand what my healing journey would look like. None of my training or knowledge eased the tightness in my chest or the tension in my jaw. It did not quell my night terrors or ebb the desire to pull my hair out. After 3 months of flashbacks, panic attacks, barely eating, and irritability, I exploded to my therapist, sobbing, asking him why I couldn't seem to shake it, frustrated that I was not proving to be the exception. He said to me, "Stop yelling over it and listen to it. What is your anxiety trying to tell you?" I had never considered that my anxiety was a voice. It would be years until I could recognize that my voice as my own. But from that session, I began working on trying to hear my anxiety before it started to scream, when it was still communicating at a whisper. I found that the only way to hear was to get still and listen. The only way to get through my panic was to surrender. During the bitter work of healing from my sexual assault, I was able to address a lot of personal trauma. At first, I wanted to categorize the work as forgiving myself for living up to the expectations of being an educated Black woman who could handle anything thrown at her and keep her cool. But truly, it was an unlearning process to those expectations and accepting myself for who I am, as I am, that was my salvation. Audre Lorde said, "If I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive." In the time directly after my assault, that sentiment resonated so deeply it became something of a mission statement. It was as if my anxiety was screaming no over and over again at the world, asserting that I would not be crushed under the weight of a narrative I never chose. After my assault, I found myself opting out of performing femininity. I cut all my hair off. I stopped wearing perfume and makeup. I all but abandoned my love of fashion. I was less available. I no longer had the capacity for caretaking and nurturing that I had before. I became much more selfish and self-centered. I felt the pull from some people around me to get over it or to at least not talk about it so much, when my inclination was to lean into my pain and speak openly about it. I wanted to be allowed to be a mess and in repair. So from the day after it happened, I kept a public blog and wrote sometimes multiple times a day. I was finding my strength in ways that were foreign to me previously because I was listening to my own voice because I was listening to my own voice instead of the echoes of expectation. I learned that being an educated Black woman meant asking for help a lot, but most of all, it required me to completely redefine the idea of strength. In fact, I took the opportunity to begin to redefine a lot of things. On a trip to Santa Fe to visit a former professor of mine, Rose, I sat in the parking lot of a grocery store and sobbed, telling her how I did not know if I could make it through the doctoral program. At the time, I felt not only overwhelmed by my PTSD, but completely uprooted. I genuinely felt as though I was losing my mind, and as someone who had been outperforming even my own expectations in graduate school before my assault, I was panicked as I saw it all slipping away. I could no longer juggle teaching and research and work. I could no longer be a social butterfly attending happy hours and network events, volunteering for community service organizations. I was constantly tired. I was irritable, often volatile. I felt like a time bomb, never knowing when a panic attack was going to come on so strong it would leave me unable to get up off the floor for the rest of the day. I told Rose every fear I had for my career and my ability to rise to the occasion of my research, which was set to be deeply complex and personal. In this moment, I was truly emotionally bare with Rose, and her response was to tell me something that would stay with me for many days to come, including today. She told me, environmental factors matter a great deal in the ripening of grapes. If, for example, a grape does not get enough sunlight or gets too much light or warmth from the sun, it can cause the fruit to go into survival mode. Sometimes the effect is that the grapes do not fully mature and balance sweetness with acidity, and they can be too much of one or the other. So the product is much more concentrated. Similarly, as our environmental factors around us grow extreme, we too go into survival mode. This can greatly influence our ability to balance and cause a sort of concentration on our own product. Jessica, right now you may not be able to produce a full-bodied Cabernet. Right now you may be a port, and that is okay, isn't it? In fact, it's wonderful. Allow yourself this moment. The idea that even when the world around me is chaotic, I could still produce and be essential and someone of value was a huge reframe for me. I would cling to the idea that beauty could be derived from pain in true alchemic form even before I could find the strength to live into the message. I was just back from anxiety and PTSD induced disability leave on November 9th, 2016, when I learned that in this country, sexual violence and misogyny are not a deal breaker for many people. It felt like being assaulted all over again. I can hurt you and get away with it. They were the words that Michelle Obama used in her audiobook of Becoming that so perfectly described what I felt as I watched men escape accountability for my own perpetrator to the nation's president. I cried for hours, unable to console myself. I played those words on loop in my mind because they were exactly what had been echoing in my nightmares for months. I can hurt you and get away with it. The horrific sentiment had been the reality of my assault and would continue to be as I moved through the world and a culture that had proved itself. Once again, to not value an identity that I could not hide. How could I find my own value and my own worth in a world so determined to convince me of my disposability? In order to heal and reconcile who I was after feeling such layered violations, I had to do deep rooted unlearning, relearning, and redefining. Sometimes I had to fight to see myself through uncolonized eyes. I had to assure myself that I am not broken or discounted because of what had happened to me or because others lack the metrics to appraise my value. To be Black in predominantly white spaces for the majority of your days often means affirming yourself or going without affirmation and representation for long stretches of time. Aggressions like "I don't see color" or assumptions that educational achievement somehow offsets racism and sexism are laughable and offensive. We are intentionally robbed of opportunities to see the spectrum of who we can become. Without an accurate reflection our world becomes a funhouse mirror of distorted expectations we can never meet. More often than not, the people around me believe that they are doing me a favor by not acknowledging my differences. So in So I'll stop there and we'll continue with her essay later on. But what Jessica talks about in her work brings up why marginalized groups from Black people to women of color in general, or even just women and LGBTQ people in general, is that these spaces are not created for marginalized people to feel safe within them, and that they're often subjected to assaults and attacks that they often don't know how to deal with because these spaces assume that these assaults and attacks are not that big of a deal. And I wanted to bring up this article from Society Pages, Imposter Syndrome and the Limits of Diversity, that efforts to diversify high status fields like academia, law, and medicine sometimes fail to address the subtle cultural factors that can marginalize and exclude underrepresented groups. Lack of familiarity with field specific concepts like peer review and tenure track, or norms like networking or mentoring, can leave individuals feeling alienated. This unfamiliarity is often at the root of the unease associated with imposter syndrome. To address imposter syndrome, schools and workplaces have proposed a range of solutions, including targeted mentorship programs and additional support for non traditional students and employees. Scholars emphasize that addressing imposter syndrome should involve solutions that emphasize flourishing and well being over identity based inclusion efforts. And I bring up imposter syndrome because at the beginning of Jessica's essay, she mentions having those feelings of imposter syndrome. And the way we talk about imposter syndrome, we tend to think it's a personal failing and not, if you are in an environmental condition that doesn't allow you to thrive, of course you're going to feel a lack of belonging, a lack of security, a lack of your own personal ability to thrive in that space. It's not so much about your own personal failings, but not having the support you need in that space. And as we just read from Jessica's essay, having support systems like her friend Rose help her to see that what she's going through is normal, and it um, helps her to set the correct expectations for herself instead of shaming herself for feeling like she can't live up to something because of what she has went through. And so in thinking about that, I want to bring up how Black educational experience relates to mental health. So this article, "The Black Experience in Higher Education," talked about the different experiences that Black students have at predominantly white colleges, and how Black students often face racial hostility, both subtle and blatant. They experience microaggressions, or outright verbal or physical assaults, and when we talk about microaggressions, even that term is not helpful because it often minimizes how traumatizing a lot of these attacks are on the people who experience them. And so these assaults, whether they're verbal or they're physical, um, causes a lot of mental trauma on Black students. And students of color feel like they can't just simply enjoy their educational experience. They often feel like they have to constantly engage in activism and fighting back, and they have to put their own mental health needs on the back burner in order to fight for racial injustice. So this is this kind of heavy price and burden of attending spaces that are not cultivated to care for their well-being, um, leaves them feeling invalidated, ignored, and undervalued, especially because it's not just students who subject them to these attacks, also administrators as well minimize their experiences. Um, and so Black students often feel like they don't have a place to turn to talk about the experiences that they are feeling. And psychologists and other experts say that addressing racism in a meaningful way on campus can improve these students' health. There could also be more harm done if it's not successfully resolved or if they're put in a situation where they feel voiceless. And that was from Ivory Toldson, a professor at Howard University. So much like in Little Rock Nine, where, the students weren't able to express their day-to-day experiences and they had no actual support system to turn to express what they were going through, that can cause, psychological damage if it is not resolved in any way by those who are leading these educational institutions. And it's not just with students, it's also with, Black professors and teachers as well. This is from The Souls of Black Professors by Colleen Flaherty. Scholars discuss what it's like to be a Black professor in 2020, who should be doing who should be doing anti-racist work on campus, and why diversity interventions that attempt to fix Black academics for a rigged game miss the point entirely. Scholars said they are sick of institutions hiring Black faculty members to reach diversity goals and then ignoring issues of racial climate and social isolation when these professors arrive. And they're more than tired of the casual and structural anti Blackness reflected in everyday conversations, resource and funding allocations, personnel decisions, and more. And often professors have to experience biases from other professors, from students. For example, students writing student evaluations that look down on them because of their identity, microaggressions they experience from students, students not respecting their titles or respecting their position as professors and teachers, and also administration who hire them. They will not have promotion or opportunities for advancements often because of administration's biases. So, as you can see, going back to what I said about um, legal frameworks and quotas and diversity goals don't make up for not creating cultural conditions and environments that allow for marginalized people to thrive. So it ends up becoming a kind of symbolic gesture and not actually something that is working to help these communities. And this is more about Black college prospects, students who are applying for various colleges and universities, that knowing all these experiences and knowing how they might be treated in these spaces affects their decisions and choices in choosing what college and universities to go to. Um, because they know that there might be a higher level of anxiety, stress, depression, and other kind of physical ailments that can come with that stress, they often will choose schools that feel safer for them so they don't have to endure um, all those traumatizing experiences. So another example is uh, there's the theory of racial battle fatigue is the common term, where having to endure not just all these assaults and attacks, but also not having spaces where you can turn to, spaces of care on these campuses also affects how Black students and professors feel on these campuses as well. And oftentimes barriers to care for students and professors is because the counseling centers are under-resourced. They have long wait times, they're not affordable, and also there's insufficient staff diversity. And in thinking about staff diversity, if just like with Jessica being able to turn to Rose, if the students don't feel like they have someone who can relate to their personal experiences, who will affirm their experiences and let them know that they're not exaggerating or making things up, but can relate and understand, that is helpful in them being able to manage and deal with the traumatizing experiences they deal with. So in thinking about educational spaces and safety overall, um, we need to keep in mind all the racial and other biases that still exist in schools and college campuses. From racial profiling, where students will be on a campus and security will automatically think that they don't belong there just because they're Black or from any other marginalized community. Hate crimes and assaults from other students, and also thinking about school to prison pipeline where um, Black students and other students of colors receive harsher punishments, and those harsher punishments can lead to limitation of choices, and those limitation of choices leads them to a life of crime essentially and ending up in prison because of the early engagement with administration and teachers who may be biased against them. So all this goes into various microaggressions, covert racism, and structural racism. How it's not simply about creating laws that uh, that allow allow for discrimination to um, be taken away, but also creating spaces and cultivating spaces to minimize that discrimination as well. And thinking about imposter syndrome with students and professors, how it's not about personal failings, but again, creating a space where students and professors of color feel like they can belong and feel like they can thrive in this space, and the expectations of them are managed in a way that keep in mind their personal experiences as well. And of course, we have to bring in intersectionality as well for Black women and LGBTQ people. And when we think of, for example, sexual assault, how creating spaces that think about how multiple identities intersect with one another. For example, with Jessica and her own assault, how she didn't feel like she had really anyone to turn to in her educational space, to talk about her assault, right? And how, like, with Black women students, for example, they don't think that they can turn to police and other student staff because they don't believe that they will believe them or support them. And also, when it comes to the intersections of race, they're afraid of getting Black cis hetero men in trouble as well. So understanding that and creating and cultivating spaces that keeps that in mind as well. So all these different factors of safety have to be incorporated that come from the point of view of what it means for a Black student or any other marginalized student to be in that space. And I bring up this other article about from Educator Writers Association that talked about how they say Hispanic, but Latin, American people and Black students as well, um, that they often choose, safe schools because they are afraid of the treatment that they're gonna receive in certain educational spaces because they are not familiar with these spaces. They are afraid that with the different cultural differences in these campus spaces, they're not gonna receive the proper guidance that they need to be in that space. So I wanna give this prompt, to think about your own school experience. What was school like for you, growing up? What or now if you are currently a student? What experiences in school traumatize you, affecting your overall wellness? This could be mental, your emotions, your physical health, but also, like, not all school experiences are bad. So, what school experiences were positive for your overall wellness? And what do you wish you had at school that would have improved the experience as well? So, I'll give you a few minutes to write a response for that. Okay, I hope you were able to write some responses for that, and feel free to continue writing on your own time as well. So, I also want to mention that the picture here is of a freedom school, and freedom schools were schools that were created in various Black communities during the time of the 60s, while school integration was happening. Also, Black communities created their own schools to create spaces that were culturally centered for Black students and actually like help them thrive in better ways than they actually were in other types of schools. So let us continue with Jessica's essay. In South Africa, a common greeting is Sawubona, which translates to I see you or I acknowledge your existence. The response to this greeting is Sikona, which means I am here. When you see me, you bring me into existence. The more I think about it, the more it feels as though in every space I enter, I am waiting for someone to exchange this pleasantry with, not just in a word, but in intention. And usually I am met with silence. What I have come to understand, though, is that most people lack the capacity because so many have only been taught to notice whiteness. This white world of higher education was not designed to acknowledge me as I am, to value me and people who look like me. So often, the only way I am allowed to be seen there is when I perform and take on the traits of whiteness. I am heard when I speak articulately or dress professionally. I am allowed to exist, but just barely. The open neglect of my authentic being authorized by someone else's poverty of consciousness. I started to use the same techniques of healing from my assault in reconciling my professional conflicts. Having grace for myself allowed me to be the Black woman and professor who admitted openly to my students that I was struggling with symptoms from anxiety and panic disorders and PTSD, and invited self care days into the syllabus as excused absences. I made a choice that if I believed in my own work, that authenticity and mutuality are keys to connection, that I had to combat the shame, doubt, and fear that held me hostage. I repeated the words of Brene Brown, echoing Audre Lorde as though they were a meditation mantra. Shame is a tool of the oppressor. Shame is meant to evoke a trauma response. Shame is meant to produce fear and fight. I said to myself as I fought my way through to get and stay present. I was adamant even before I believed it that I had nothing to be ashamed of because I did nothing to deserve what happened to me. Further, I was not responsible for other people's beliefs about me. I began to understand what it meant to move from a place where it was well within my soul, and that was enough. Even as I began to heal and find acceptance within myself, I did not mean that my environment would always respond in kind. The dissonance of my personal wellness journey would bring in toxic professional environments would be ca- cacophonous. I was out sick from anxiety when my former supervisor called and asked me to resign. They claimed it was in our mutual best interest, but I knew it was because I pushed for accommodations for my health and because as a Black woman, no one thought I deserved them. I knew I was being asked to resign because prior to being out sick for my anxiety disorder, I'd met with many Black and Brown students, helping them advocate against racial mistreatment by faculty and administration. I knew it was because I was not a good soldier, as my supervisor once asked me to be. I had dared to define myself as something else. In conversation with my uncle that will forever stick with me, I was explaining that I did not understand why I could not do what I'd seen others do and just press on, or at at the very least shut up more. After losing my job, I did not feel smart or capable or like I could ever get back to a place where I could be proud of myself again. My uncle told me in so many words, "This is exactly what you are supposed to be doing." He assured me that not everybody knows how to stand up for themselves. And sometimes when you draw boundaries, not everyone will like them or even agree to them, but you cannot make that your problem. God sent you on an assignment here to be you. Don't let anyone else give you another assignment. I had to figure out how to manage the boundary of being authentic within an environment that did not always welcome variant truths. People do not like to be made to feel uncomfortable. Further, in American society, we go out of our way to avoid discomfort because we have little to no tolerance for experiencing pain. We constantly look for ways to self soothe, self medicate, or willfully remain ignorant to pain so that we do not have to introduce suffering to our awareness. We eat comfort foods, we drink to take off the edge, we pay entertainers millions of dollars to provide us with many respites from our own misery. So when I consider the hesitancy of others to ingest the reality of a Black woman, a fat, dark skinned, queer Black woman with mental health disabilities, to be exact, I am not surprised there is no space or tolerance for my story. Do you know what the problem that has no name that Betty Friedan spoke of is for a Black woman? It is a primal scream in the middle of a garden party full of white people claiming to love that song. We have been singing our pain, painting our truth, dancing our joy, healing and nursing generations, and still people act as though our plight is a mystery, or at best a subplot, and not a symptom of the bitter internal work we all collectively avoid. As I healed and redefined, I also had to learn how to cultivate new communities and environments that allowed me to be seen and heard for who I was, and not just who someone needed me to be. I took a class called the Tao of Healing, and in it, we got to interview a group of survivalists, people who habitually prepared for the end of the world. They spoke about how they planned, what they anticipated, and why they felt it is important to be mindful of the myriad outcomes for the future. I cannot remember who asked the question, but from the class came an inquiry that shifted the way I consider not only the unknown, but also working through spaces from a place of vulnerability and uncertainty. As a survivalist, someone who is always preparing for the end of the world and training in how to survive unexpected outcomes, what do you need? Is it a tool? Is it water? Is it the perfect shelter? What would be the one thing, if you could think of it, that someone needs to survive the unknown? The survivalist barely hesitated before asserting, quite frankly, the thing you cannot do without is people you can trust. And I'll skip down a little. Um, I continue to turn over the irony of being proud of my professional accomplishments and being complicit in a system of classism, exclusion, discrimination, and oppression. Being successful in higher education was and is very conflicting for me because in order to achieve, you have to become adept at assimilating. And despite your best efforts, you begin to internalize a culture of beliefs you never wanted or asked for in the first place. It is a sacrifice you don't even realize you're making until you made it. I find my peace in knowing that my presence within the academy changes the academy. I found myself determined not only to discover and lean into more of who I was as a Black woman, but to do so without shame and in open search of a community that would bring me into existence as long as I committed to being seen. And I'll end with here before we run out of time. Maybe you should teach people how to be uncomfortable. And you can read the rest on your own if you get the book. But in thinking about what Jessica said about cultivating spaces that help someone like her thrive, and spaces that center her identity and who she is and her personal experiences as well. And I want to bring this quote from Schools and Black Students' Mental Health. The kids aren't all right. Dr. Celeste Malone, the president of the elect of the National Association for School Psychologists, and and a Howard University associate professor said she wants schools to offer spaces for students from a variety of minoritized backgrounds, whether it's race, ethnicity, or sexuality, to come together, talk about their unique experiences, and develop a community. She also wants counselors to be intentional about asking students about the impacts of discrimination and racism, creating a space for them to talk about it, plus creating partnerships with community mental health providers and organizations will help schools learn to think about cultural aspects and adapt new practices. So in thinking about what a healthy school is, um, um, ensuring that a school environment thinks about what is physically and psychologically safe for the students that allows them to learn and grow completely as people as well. That in schools that don't put first the people who are the most marginalized and the people who are not the spaces were not created to think of, that in order to create better spaces, we need to think of those who the space wasn't created for in the first place. And bringing up this person, Catherine Peach D'Angelo, who said, education has long been touted as a great equalizer. However, passive education environments in which teachers don't engage with race equalize nothing for children of color. Well-resourced schools and qualified teachers are not enough to meet the individual needs of students. To achieve positive educational outcomes for children of all races and backgrounds, school leaders must constantly examine and intentionally design the learning environment, much like how Jessica intentionally designs her learning environment as well to include all the needs of the students. And this includes a curriculum that dispels false images and stereotypes, book lists that feature works that empower marginalized students, implicit bias training for teachers and administrators, and a clear plan and committed resources for hiring and retaining teachers of color and enrolling and retaining students of color. And I want to bring this quote from Charlie Cobb Jr. Education should enable children to possess their own lives instead of living at the mercy of others, centering the most marginalized and cultivating a space so they can thrive. So to end, I want to end with this prompt. What is your dream school or place of learning? If you could cultivate a healthy space for learning, what would it be like? Create a plan for it. What are your needs? What are your goals for it? What needs do you think others would have? What do you anticipate from it? What tools would you like to have? Who would you like to have in your community of learning? What kind of teachings, lessons, and values do you want to have as the foundation for your school? And below is a picture from the Black School. They're based in New Orleans, and they take inspiration from the freedom schools that I mentioned earlier in the workshop. And they're creating their own educational space that is centered on helping Black students thrive in ways that they often don't get to in other school spaces. So I'll let that be a takeaway prompt for you so we don't run out of time. But I wanted to share some final resources as well to help you continue thinking about education and wellness. So we have Diversity in America. It's a great uh, Instagram site that talks about various experiences of various identities and especially marginalized identities and their experiences within institutional education. There's Race on Campus from the Chronicle that is various articles that also explores that as well. There's also resources for Black students, their mental health needs, and it's just a list of resources for various contacts that you can reach out to and support systems that you can reach out to for dealing with racial trauma on college campuses. There's also Inside Higher Ed, which also looks deeply into educational experiences. Reimagining critical race theory in education, mental health healing, and the pathway to liberatory praxis is an article that dives deeper into these issues as well. And finally, The Failures of Integration, How Race and Class Are Undermining the American Dream, that looks more deeply into the history of integration and the places in which it didn't succeed in the ways we hoped it would. And I thank you. And if you have any questions, feel free to share them in the chat.
Charisse, thank you so much. My gosh, that was a lot to learn, digest, think about in a short period of time, but it was very well done. And I don't know if we'll have any questions, but I have a thought that I'd love to share. If that's okay.
Mhm.
So in the writings of Jessica Williams, the last piece you left us with, which I wrote down, maybe you should teach people how to be uncomfortable. That
Mhm.
really struck me because as a white woman, these conversations, these topics, this information that you're bringing to the table
Mhm.
really wasn't present to me until I was much older. And
Mhm.
thinking about your recommendations and your resources around education for younger students, I'm just thinking about for populations that may not be considered marginalized, what is our responsibility as adults to make sure that children who may identify as white or non-marginalized, or children who are often thought as seen, how do we make them more uncomfortable, or maybe uncomfortable isn't even the word, imparting this kind of information and these conversations at an earlier age so that it's not a surprise when you're older. This is our reality, and how do we sort of learn and sort of, I don't know, do you know what I'm getting at? I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Um, I think the important thing to do is create a space for asking questions to engage each other in conversation, and from a place of humbleness as well. Because understanding that, like, even with me, I had the same thing of not learning a lot of these things from an early age. I didn't know a lot of these things until recently as well. So creating a space of, this is a space of learning. This isn't a space of centering yourself or feeling bad or feeling guilty about things. This is a space of knowing that you don't know a lot, and presenting information from that point of view of, like, this is us learning. This
Mm,
is us learning each other. This is us learning about the environment and the world around us, and how
mhm,
that has shaped us into being. It's not personal. It's
mhm.
just knowing ourselves better and knowing each other better and knowing the world around us better.
Right. And I think knowing the structure for which this country was built on is a part of that, right? I mean, I don't know, I'm not a teacher, so I don't know how teachers are trained, but so much of what you share that has, whether it's critical race theory, or you just think about systemic racism and all of the pieces you talked about sort of in the 1900s, which we could, of course, think back to even as early as 1619, there are things that I wonder if we also as adults need to learn and train ourselves in content wise, so that when these kinds of questions, these open conversations come up, we also have some knowledge that we can use to help shape the conversation if needed. So there's like sort of a skill building aspect to this that I think adults might need assistance with for children in a classroom, but there's also like the content of it. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, or if you feel similarly or different, but that's what I was thinking about.
Yeah, and this is why I encourage people to develop a curious mind and ask questions, because the content is out there. Um, I shouldn't be um, forced to have to provide it because I'm still learning myself,
Right.
and I had to take my own energy and do it. So I expect you to do the same as well. But,
Yeah.
like, the content is out there. It's just you have to be willing to be open to learning all of that, and ask questions and think with a critical mind that, like, some information is correct, some information isn't correct, and I have to use my discernment as well. So
Yeah.
a lot of it is developing that practice for yourself as
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
Yeah. Well said. I know we don't have any questions in the chat as of now, so I appreciate you entertaining some of my thoughts and considerations. I really enjoyed the session, and I'm very grateful for your time with us today and all the research that it took to put that together. So
Thank
thank you so much, Charisse.
you. Thank you, and thank you for your questions and thoughts as well.
Okay, have a great day. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.